So anyway, thanks everybody for coming. Delighted to see a fantastic turnout. It's going to be an amazing weekend. Incredibly important topic, especially now. So I hope everyone has early voted. I didn't tell you which way to vote, I just hope you've early voted. And so let me introduce our illustrious speaker this evening, our good friend, Tom Udall. And I'll just read some biographical background on Tom. And so, if you don't know, Tom Udall is Senior United States Senator for New Mexico. He's a friend of the Santa Fe Institute. And he's here tonight with his wife, who I want to mention, Jill. Where are you, Jill? Where's Jill? At the back. And I should say, Jill is also a lawyer, trained as a lawyer. She has a degree in mathematics. As an undergraduate, she studied mathematics. And she's a member of the President's Committee on the Arts and the Humanities. Okay, a little bit on Tom. Tom's been a senator from New Mexico since 2009, after 2 decades as U.S. Representative and New Mexico's State Attorney General. He has degrees from Prescott College, Arizona, and a law degree from Downing College, Cambridge. It's the other place to me. I was at Oxford. I don't willingly acknowledge that place, which is in England, by the way, if it were not and a JD from UNM. Tom sat on the United States House of Representatives Committee on Appropriations. He served in the Subcommittee on the Interior, the Environment, the Subcommittee on Labor, Health and Human Services, on Education, and the Subcommittee on Legislative Branch. So he's no stranger to the limitless complexities and arcana of state and federal regulation. To his great credit, and I didn't know this about you, and I'm extremely delighted, Tom was one of the first members of Congress to publicly express concern about the possibility of NSA overreach, and this was a year before Edward Snowden's 2013 disclosure. So you're on the side of the good, Tom. And he voted against Patriot Act. Double hero. Okay. And that's a completely non-political remark. In 2013, Tom introduced into the Senate the Sandia Pueblo Settlement Technical Amendment, a bill that would transfer land to the Sandia Pueblo tribe. Tom also introduced a proposed amendment to the Constitution that it would allow limits on outside spending in support of political candidates. And something that I know is very dear to Tom's heart, because we've discussed it at length, and I suspect you'll talk about it tonight. In 2015, he sponsored a bill to amend and reauthorize the Toxic Substances Control Bill that was signed into law by President Barack Obama on June 22nd, 2016. So with that, I welcome you, Tom. Thank you very much for coming and speaking with us. It's a very important time in this nation's history for us to deal with these issues, and I think that regulation and law is definitely an area where the expertise of SFI could make a positive contribution. Welcome, Tom.
David, thank you so much for that really generous introduction, and it's wonderful to be here with your absolutely terrific distinguished, illustrious crowd, and thank you for recognizing Jill. I may say something else in a little bit, but this is a topic that she also is interested in. And as you know, I mentioned earlier, Senator Bingaman, who is a trustee, I believe, of SFI, this is something this topic that you should really probe him on and push him, because he's got incredible experience in terms of his 30 years in the United States Senate and being a 4-year state attorney general and dealing with the prosecutorial side there. So I want to thank you for inviting me tonight to really join you. It's a rare treat to have the opportunity to address scholars and researchers who have made and are making significant contributions to the progress of mankind, and I'm just honored to be here. In fact, I was asking Jill on the way over if in her wildest dreams she would ever have expected me to be in the company of Murray Gell-Mann, so to speak, to be the keynote speaker at a world-renowned Santa Fe Institute with this illustrious crowd. And she said, "Tom, you are not in my wildest dreams." But she has been an incredible partner for me in this adventure of public service, and honey, I love you very much, and it's great that you're here this evening. And she helped me with this speech too. I expect that I have been invited because after more than 25 years of public service under our system of laws and regulations, as a state attorney general, a congressman, and a senator, I may have something to add to a symposium devoted to the evolution and complexity of that system. Our founding fathers didn't intend for it to be complex. John Adams famously said, "We are a government of laws, not men," a concept that dates back to the ancient Greeks. It's this basic idea, the rule of law, that is at the core of the American conceit, that it is possible to achieve the ideal of individual freedom. From the Declaration of Independence to the United States Constitution, which carefully delineates the authority of the three branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial, there is a recognition that human society needs government, but also that government should be kept in check by laws preventing any one person from furthering personal interests at the expense of the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. The intent was to prevent a government of special interests. So what happened? How did we manage to gum up the works? First, I'd blame money. In 1976, the Supreme Court in Buckley versus Vallejo ruled that money equals speech under the First Amendment. And the system has never been the same since. Money buys elections, not all of them, but it is a very important factor. What used to be a bell curve of moderates from both parties, clustered around the middle, is now exactly the opposite. There are fewer competitive racers, fewer willing to compromise, and the constant fear of being targets of dark money from special interests pushes candidates to the fringes. Second, the erosion of the rules in favor of maintaining the status quo. The current practice of requiring 60 votes to pass a law instead of a simple majority is an assault on democracy. In addition, the Senate has vested unfettered power in the leadership. The committee chairs control what bills make it out of committee, and the majority leader decides what bills will come up for a vote. And third, I'd suggest that the schedule of the Senate, allowing members to travel back to their states every weekend, results in the erratic passage or not of legislation based on time constraints rather than the merits of the bill. We pass, for example, continuing resolutions rather than proper budgets because members will not stick around to get the work done. That's the bigger picture. Have we gone from a government of laws to a government of men? Can the Senate still function as the founders intended? Well, I have one example. A desperately needed reform of one of the foundational environmental laws was enacted this year despite these obstacles. And I'm going to give you the story of this. In 1976, Congress passed the Toxic Substances Control Act, known as TSCA, to allow the government, through rules and regulations, to protect us from the thousands of chemicals in the products that surround us and impact our bodies and biological systems. In much the same manner, I suppose, as we look to government to protect us from other dangers. It was an agreement between Republicans and Democrats, very bipartisan, industry, and environmental and public health groups. EPA was tasked with the regulatory role. It spent 10 years studying and analyzing the health risks of asbestos, a cause of untreatable terminal diseases. Asbestos was used in a lot of products because it's an effective flame retardant. EPA issued a regulation to ban asbestos. Industry challenged the rule, citing a provision of the law that required EPA to do an analysis proving that their rule was the least burdensome alternative to get to the same result. The U.S. Court of Appeals of the Fifth Circuit sided with industry in 1991, and the EPA rule was blocked. After that, the EPA determined that the least burdensome requirement was an insurmountable problem. Regulation of toxic chemicals under TSCA ceased for all intents and purposes for the next 25 years, 1991 until this year. This, in spite of the fact that new untested chemicals were coming on the market at the rate of 750 to 1,500 a year. It's clear that some kind of reform of TSCA was needed. Frank Lautenberg, Senator Lautenberg from New Jersey, began the process, and when he died in 2013, I picked up the ball. States had been taking stabs at the problem to varying degrees with intermittent success. Industry decided it was better to comply with a viable federal law than a viable federal law rather than a myriad of inconsistent state laws. The chemical industry, a major special interest lobby, supported the reform of TSCA. The obstruction in this case came from the left-leaning environmentalists. It was the classic battle of the perfect being the enemy of the good. It was essential that industry buy in, but they were not going to give in to the extremist demands. It was my position that some reform is better than none, and I went to work with Senator David Vitter, my co-author, a conservative Republican from Louisiana, which is home to several chemical corporations. It took us nearly 3 years. We had to build, one by one, a list of 60 or more co-sponsors to withstand a filibuster. I had to convince members of my own party to defy their leadership to get the bill out of the authorizing committee. I had to spend my hard-earned environmental capital to push for a bill opposed by too many groups committed to the pursuit of the perfect. And I had to rail against attempts to attach the bill to other legislation I could not support. But it got done, and quite honestly, I feel pretty proud of the effort. Another of the legislative reform things that I'd like to talk about that kind of elucidate what we're into here is the reform in response to climate change. Some of you may have heard of the Waxman-Markey climate bill from 2009-2010. It would have set a limit on greenhouse gas emissions and set up a system of cap and trade. It passed the House with a relatively narrow majority, but it failed even to get a vote in the Senate, and much less receive the supermajority necessary to defeat the filibuster it would have met. A complicated issue to be sure, but there were simple solutions. For example, set the price on carbon at $25 or $50 per ton indexed to inflation, period. But interest groups on both sides, industry and environmental, wanted various details to be spilled out. Many of them reasonable, some not. In the end, it was blocked by powerful interest groups that used the procedural obstacles of the Senate to snuff out any hope of a bipartisan climate deal. Republican senators who had voted for and sponsored similar climate bills in the past stepped away quickly. Democratic senators who faced problems back in their home states on the issue preferred to work on other issues, and so no law was passed to address a massive problem that good science says threatens life as we know it on this planet. So legislative body doesn't do its job. Next, the president steps in with a clean power plan. He encouraged the EPA to use its authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases as a pollutant that endangers human health and the environment. EPA produced a solid plan which allowed regions of the country to use their local energy resources to meet national clean energy targets. The President's Clean Power Plan is being challenged in court as we speak here, and if the Supreme Court does not allow the EPA to proceed, the only recourse is to go back to Congress. Reform of the Clean Air Act is even less likely to pass than the reform of TSCA. This time, the private interest groups with a stake in the outcome are arrayed against reform. They have the money and the influence to block it. Between Citizens United, under which the system is awash in unregulated dark money buying influence, there is little chance global warming reform will become law. Now, one on regulation, since something caught my eye, David, on your symposium and what you passed out, and it was a quote by Winston Churchill. And here's his quote: "If you have 10,000 regulations, you destroy all respect for the law." That's Winston. If that is the case, we have a problem. According to the Congressional Research Service, I asked them to look into this, we publish a few thousand federal regulations each year. So it doesn't take very long to get to 10,000, folks. However, my respect for Mr. Churchill notwithstanding, I'm not convinced that he is correct on this point. I don't know about you, but the fact that the Food and Drug Administration has regulations for food and drug safety, and the Federal Aviation Administration has regulations for safe air travel, and the National Highway Safety Administration has rules that makes cars safer and travel on our highways safer, and the Environmental Protection Agency has regulations to limit the amount of pollution that can be dumped in our air and water. You know, I would say to Winston, it is not the raw number of regulations which is important. Shouldn't the benchmark be whether we have safe food and drugs, whether our travel on our highways has fewer fatalities, whether our air travel has the same, and whether having less disease, we're having less disease as a result of pollution. The vast majority of regulations do not burden us as individuals, they make our lives better. And I already had a little debate, because there's another part of this, and I hope you'll ask questions about this and get it in. So people talk to me about biotechnology and some of these areas many of your companies are involved in. It's totally true that in this regulatory area, that regulations can stamp out innovation. I don't have any doubt about that. And that's why in these regulatory agencies, we need to have tough, smart decision makers who are willing to take a little bit of risk. And sometimes we get people that are willing to take no risk. And so that's an issue on the regulatory front, David, that I think you're going to deal with for a long time. So in summary here, I just want to tell you what I'm going to continue on for my structural reforms and my strategy. I think, and I think to have the most power, the potential to unblock the gridlock in Congress, that's what I want to focus on. These will be my priority. The first is campaign finance reform, specifically turning back the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United that has removed all meaningful limits on campaign contributions and expenditures. Consider this: the Washington Post recently analyzed campaign spending. It found that just 10 mega donors contributed nearly 20% of the $1.1 billion raised by super PACs by the end of August. Consider the influence this money can buy. Much of it out of sight, with little or no disclosure. And that amount is almost $250 million more dollars than super PACs collected in the entire 2012 election cycle. It's escalating upward. Reasonable limits on contribution and spending would rein in the reality and perception that votes are for sale to the highest bidder. The excesses we are seeing have prompted both presidential candidates to address the problem one way or another. I've introduced a constitutional amendment that would allow the federal government and the states to set limits on campaign contributions and limits on campaign expenditures. I also support legislation at a minimum that would force disclosure of the new universe of unregulated campaign finance. Both proposals have received more than 50 votes in the Senate in recent years. The disclosure bill got 59 votes in 2012, just one shy of defeating the filibuster. Which brings me to my second structural change. Change the filibuster rules. A filibuster is a debate by one or more senators intended to slow or block considerable consideration of a bill or nomination. According to a legend, George Washington is said to have told Jefferson that the framers had created the Senate to cool House legislation, just as a saucer was used to cool hot tea. What started as a rarely used measure to cut off Senate debate has become a way to stop legislating altogether. Most people don't know that what we are dealing with now is the practice of virtual filibuster, where one senator, for whatever reason, can pick up the phone and simply threaten to filibuster a bill. That's all it takes. To end this virtual filibuster or invoke cloture or cut debate off takes 60 votes. It would take 67 votes under the Senate rules to change the Senate rules on the filibuster. Tilting at windmills and remaining hopeful. I will once again move for the adoption of Senate rules changes that will allow bills to be passed by a simple majority. Democracy, I believe, is best. My reform would permit what we call a talking filibuster, meaning that filibustering members must be on the Senate floor, expending time and energy in debate, not simply phoning it in. We remember the great movie that you all will, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. The Senate is designed to operate as a deliberative body, but we are not deliberating, we are just not acting. Changing the filibuster rules would allow the Senate to get moving. Sure, this would make it easier to pass bills I like, but it would also make it easier to pass bills I do not like. It would make the process of lawmaking more transparent and accountable. Members would have to defeat bills with their public votes, not hide behind obscure procedural gridlock. When I started working on rules reform in 2009, no one was interested, and many from my own party were opposed. Support has grown every year since 2011. We made the most significant changes to Senate rules in a generation in January 2013. We eliminated filibusters on some minor motions. We made it simpler to confirm nominees, but it wasn't enough. The Senate went further in November 2013, eliminating the filibuster for executive and federal court nominations, except the U.S. Supreme Court. That's a good start. Structural changes, campaign finance reform and rules reform, are important to get democracy working better in a government of laws. I worry that we are not only becoming a government of men, but of personal agendas and of big egos. Now, David, you asked me to talk about my strategy, and that's really what I'm going to close on here. My strategy for reform requires a willingness to compromise. Ben Franklin said that compromise doesn't make great heroes, but it does make good democracy. My strategy for reform requires working on a bipartisan basis, finding a partner in the other party, as I did with David Vitter on TSCA. My strategy requires giving stakeholders a place at the table and keeping them there until there's a consensus. If the symposium can come up with ways, your symposium here, to get us past this gridlock, this dysfunctional government, well, all power to you. And I want to thank you again for this special opportunity, the opportunity to describe my experience and my ideas, but also the opportunity to hear from you and to get your perspective on how your work and your study in this area might help us in Washington. And David, I just want to tell you that I want to lend my good offices and myself to help you as you work through this project. And so now I'm happy to answer questions, hear comments, engage in discussion, and you told me you're going to help me out here a little bit to recognize people if you're not blinded by that light. But thank you very much. Great to be with you this evening. Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
So let's get started. So no one in this room is a shrinking violet. We want to fight. You don't have to agree with Tom, but you have to have a debate. And so I see a few, Leighton maybe, and Gary. Okay, let's start with you, Gary. And there's a mic that's circulating, so wait for the mic. And then we've got Dan up front.
Just a quick question on clarification.
You bet.
As I understand, so if, to be concrete, if Hillary wins, and if the Democrats win the Senate, and if the opposition is obstructionist, you are absolutely in favor of the so-called nuclear option in the Senate?
Yeah, I don't call it the nuclear option. I call it the constitutional option. And almost, I met others from around the world here. Almost every legislative body at the beginning of every session looks at its rules, evaluates how the rules worked in the past session, and adopts changes so that you can get better democratic procedures. And so the Constitution gives each of the House and the Senate the right to make its rules at the beginning of each session. And what I'm going to propose, I don't know what will happen, but if it doesn't matter. I've done it in the minority and the majority. You were suggesting that I would only do it if we were in the majority. I've done it in the minority. I've done it in the majority. And so I believe what it is at stake here, and this frustration you see, is this is about our democracy, and this is part of the gridlock. People don't see it working. At least if you win the Senate and you have 52 votes, pass something over to the House. Maybe a Republican House, probably is going to be, but then they have to work with each other. The president can weigh in, but what happens is House sends us something, we deadlock, we send them something, deadlock, and so it would make it more transparent, I believe. And I don't know whether we have the votes or not, Gary. I don't, but thank you. Go ahead. Move the mic around here a little bit.
I'm just moving it around.
It's nice getting out of that light.
Well, very good on the Toxic Act. That was terrific. TSCA. My question is, we're in a 50-50 country.
Yeah.
You need legitimacy is very, very important. And to me, when you're in a 50-50 country and you want to pass controversial legislation, shouldn't the supermajority be necessary? Because otherwise, if something gets rammed through 51-49, or in the House by 3 votes, and the Senate, depends on how it goes, a lot of people will feel frozen out. And aside from the healthcare law, most major controversial legislation passed with bipartisan support and with supermajorities. So don't you think, given where the country is right now, is because the Republicans, you could have Donald Trump president, you could have 52-48 Republicans in the Senate, they could ram things through. And don't you think, from the point of view of legitimacy, it might be right to have more than a simple majority to pass important stuff?
Well, I understand the point you're making about legitimacy, but what has happened in the Senate, the filibuster, if you follow the history, I gave you a little of it, but I want to tell you how it started so you understand how it's completely been flipped the other way. Back in World War I, we had a president who was very concerned about our ships being shot out at sea, and he got something through the House and almost got something through the Senate, and 11 senators stood up on the Senate floor and made the time run out, and his bill failed. There was nothing stopping those 11 senators. They were able to run the clock out. There was no rule to cut off debate, okay? And so he just got furious, and that's when we put in about early 1900s, a filibuster rule. It was only there to cut off if you had really rambunctious 6 or 7 senators. It wasn't to try to change the tradition of the Senate to debate things thoroughly, to hear everybody out, and then pass a piece of legislation. Hopefully, like you say, by a big majority with Democrats and Republicans on each side. But it is now used. I can tell you, you can't do anything in the Senate. We are completely deadlocked. And it's gotten worse. I went into the House in 1998. So I did 10 years, and now since 2008 in the Senate. The partisanship has gotten worse, and my sense is we'd be a lot better off to go back to democracy, which you have a check because of what the House is going to do. If let's say the Republicans, I'm going to tell you how I'm going to react if we have Trump and we have a Republican Senate. If they start working on a bill and they take our proposals and they work with us, I'm going to be on their bills. And that's the way it should work, is that you should be working with each other and trying to say, I stand on these principles, I've run on these things, but there are areas we can work on. And what most senators will tell you on both sides of the aisle, it's what we call in Washington the 80% rule. And you could do it in this room. We could pick the most conservative 4 people and the most liberal 4 and say, sit down for an hour and figure out some things you agree on. And most of the time, in the range of 70 or 80%, you can get agreement. It's these controversial things out around the edge where there's disagreement. So pull together, work on those areas, and do something. And unfortunately, I think this filibuster rule, where it's gone to such an extreme, I just think it hurts democracy. And so I believe that if you change that, and if you flip the thing, if Hillary Clinton's in and we're in the majority, I would hope we worked in such a way through the committee system. We wouldn't let bills out of committee unless they were bipartisan. We'd get them on the floor. Everybody would have amendments. We have no amendments anymore. I mean, the process has come to a complete halt.
That never happened when
so-
Harry Reid ran the Senate.
Well, it's on both sides. It's on both sides. I mean, and there are successes on both sides. You were talking, Tosca was hardly covered. One of the things that's frustrating, the climate we're in, is that you have positive things like Tosca reform. Not a single senator voted against the final bill, and it passed the House 412 to 4. And so it was unbelievable, the bipartisanship. It wasn't even covered. I mean, Jill was so frustrated that we didn't get any articles. She said, Tom, this is the major environmental piece of legislation, the biggest one in 30 years, and nobody even knows it happened. And it's true. And so we're dealing in a tough environment. I think if you're transparent and you're moving things and you're open and our system has a great deal for exchange. If you have a Republican House and a Democratic Senate and whatever the president is, whatever party, they all 3 have to work together on what the big problems are. And there are a lot of these areas. Let me pick one, infrastructure. Yeah, we should all agree that we should be rebuilding our country right now in the infrastructure, whether it's crumbling schools or putting broadband into every community, highways, bridges, all of that. And yet, every time you try in the Senate, you're just deadlocked. And it's not. I'm not making it partisan. You said Harry's just as bad as Mitch. So, they.
I'm going to circulate now. So we've got
okay.
John, I've got Dan, and then I've got Sandra. Okay, let me
Senator Udall,
Yeah.
Your bipartisanship comes through loud and clear, and I deeply resonate with and admire it. I think all of us here recognize the
Kiss it right up
value
against it.
and
There you go.
necessity of that in a free society. So thank you for that. Here's my question. To what extent and how often do you and others in Congress go back and do performance reviews of past legislation and regulations and try to assess all of their impact, both positive and negative, and unintended consequences?
Yeah, we do very little of that. We do very little of I think what you're talking about, what I interpret your question is oversight. So if we pass, let me pick an example, the Leave No Child Behind, which passed under, I believe, President Bush, a number of 10 plus years back or more. And normally the way Congress used to work, I have a lot of history, so this is much more painful for me because my dad served in the House in the 1950s and my uncle then succeeded him, and so I know a lot of the history. And what we used to do a lot more of is, 5 years was the full length on a bill. And then the job of the committee that had the expertise was to hold really thorough hearings leading up to the 5-year deadline and figure out exactly what you're talking about. What's going right, what's going wrong, and call in all the stakeholders. Travel across the country and do that too. And then make a judgment. And then we had an expiration of the bill at 5 years, so you had to put a new bill in place. Do you know how we do it now? Leave No Child Behind expired at 5 years. 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, 9 years. We did very little review. We just barely passed, I think, about 12 years out. And Lamar Alexander and Patty Murray, great example of bipartisanship, they passed a law now called Every Child Succeeds, which has just become law and is starting to be put in place. But that shows you the dysfunction. And to me, part of that is these rules, that's what I'm trying to get to the heart of. But anyway, and I'm just giving you one example. I think we don't do enough oversight. The other part of my reform, when I talk, part of the reason, we're chasing money, we're chasing going back home, and we're not spending the time we need to in Washington to do the work in this really complex global society we're in. And so that's where we are. And I know somebody said to me tonight, be really cheery and give us an upbeat and inspirational speech. But I thought, you're dealing with a tough subject, David, and you got some really smart people here, so I just wanted to, talk straight to you. Go ahead.
So, Senator Udall, I know there are a lot of other people who want to ask questions too, so I'll be brief. I want to bring science into your discussion of this partisanship because, in 2009, President Obama said that he would restore science to its appropriate place in government. And there's no question that in the White House there's been extraordinary investment in technology, in science, in a variety of areas. But science has become incredibly partisan, not just my climate science that I work on, but in technology, in spectrum, in genetics, in just about everything. Science itself has become incredibly politicized.
Right.
Do you think that your ideas about whether it's the filibuster or other ways, do you think this can be undone? There must be colleagues of yours on the other side of the aisle who regret this trend.
Yeah. No, you've hit on a very important subject here, and let me just. I totally agree with everything you said, and part of it, I dealt with in my talk about climate change and the science of climate change, which is pretty doggone compelling when you have 192 countries and all of their scientists and everybody buying into what's happening to us, and we're not doing the things we need to be doing. And in fact, if we lose that case on the Clean Power Plan in the Supreme Court, our credibility in the world is shot because we went to Paris. I was over where they called us, the 10 senators went to Paris, and we told everybody over there, we said, President's doing a Clean Power Plan, we've got these efficiency things with automobiles, we're doing the cafe, we're doing all this stuff, and if all of a sudden we fail at keeping these things going, we're in real trouble. So there's a credibility issue there. One of the other things that happened, and this reminds me when you talk about science and technology, in the House, up until the mid-1990s, there was a science and technology group that had really smart people in it. And if ever you had a science and technology issue as a House member, you went over and you said, all these business people have approached me and constituents, and they're telling me about this issue. Tell me what is the real story on this. And they gave it to you. We went into, in that period, and it's never been restored, we went to kind of zombie land. We abolished that completely. We just abolished it. No, I'm serious. And the idea was, well, members of Congress will do a better job if they don't know that stuff. Well, that may make for better sound bites, folk. You know, if you don't have to learn all of that stuff, you can then believe your sound bite that everything's so simple. But that's the kind of thing we need to restore. But the main part to restore, that's the thrust of your question, is the bipartisanship. And you know, you'll never hear a member of Congress, if you're in a meeting back home talking, they're all going to talk about bipartisanship. But it's a tough road, and it's a lonely road right now to do bipartisanship. And you all, as the intelligent and capable group you are, need to keep pushing your leaders to work out these things that are crucial to you. Yeah, David, go ahead. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I hope, Daniel, that was good.
All right. I should say we are here with a little group from Europe, I guess, and so I want to invite you to reflect on some thoughts that I would like to propose. Yes. So you have, it's a wonderful talk, and we are all in the world looking at this election and so on. We have been looking at the fact that you have mentioned, that there is so much money in lobbying and thereby influencing crucial decisions for the world. You have also emphasized that your institutions are, to a certain extent, failing in the sense that there is a blockade and there is a polarization in Congress and so on. So then I want to ask you to reflect on something, and I'm of course a scientist, so it will be naive realism as we call it, but and we come out of the social democrat traditions of Europe, which are slightly different, and so it's interesting. There's less money in that circuit, and there is a statement by Einstein that sometimes you need more dimensions to resolve a problem than in the space in which it builds up or starts. And one of the dimensions I can imagine is, and I ask you just to reflect on that in a longer term perspective, one of the remarkable things is that you need consensus and a mobility, political mobility, and we at least know from experience that multi-party systems have that possibility of more rich spectra of compromises. So the space of solutions is much larger, theoretically. And so that is my question. We have experience with multi-particle systems where there are much more possibilities to find compromises on all kinds of issues. And yeah, well, that's the question. Would you like to
I assume
reflect
you're
on
from
that?
a parliamentary country, right? That has
Yes.
a
Oh, the Netherlands. We come from the Netherlands.
Yeah, yeah, okay. So you know, the beauties of a parliament, and you run, you win, and you form with the other parties, and you get together, you get to control. That's and one of the things, I went over, he was kidding me about going to Cambridge. The 2 years I happened to be there going to law school, when David talked about that, I watched a British election. Yeah, they narrow it to about 6 weeks. 6 weeks. And everybody, it's on everybody's lips. You don't go into a pub without seeing people debate these things. And then it's over, and they're in for 5 years. And under the parliamentary system, you got to stick your neck out and do what you campaigned on. And if you make mistakes and the public turns against you or the government dissolves your various parties, then you got to go back and ask for it again. We don't have that system. Yes. I mean, and I don't know, you know, I'm pretty sure that if I said to my people in New Mexico, would you rather have a parliamentary system or the system we have right now? There'd probably be a lot of good debate on that. But then getting to change the Constitution to make that happen, that would be a whole different deal, because all these structures I'm talking about many of them are constitutional, about the rules and how the House and the Senate work. And by the way, supermajorities, when we talk about supermajorities, our constitutional founders thought about supermajorities. There are only 5 places in the Constitution where you talk about supermajorities, because they believe the system would work best. And that's things like overriding a veto, a treaty, those kinds of things. But they believed it would work best with majorities, with a democracy. And so I think yeah, you know, it is polarized, and I'm back to the question that was asked right over here. I think our job as leaders, even if it's 50-50 with the people out there that you're leading, I don't believe you can't find 2 or 3 or 4 issues that if you worked on as Democrats or Republicans, you couldn't sell to the public as a whole. But we're too focused on, you know, this chit for that chit and trying to figure out who's going to win the next election, and then the campaign's forever. I mean, it never quits. We don't ever, I'll guarantee you in November you're going to start seeing stories who is running for President of the United States. Yeah, Ted Cruz is already announced, so anyway, but go ahead. So there are real advantages to a parliamentary system. I don't know if you want to follow up a little bit, if I thoroughly answered your question. And I don't think the founders they talked about, they didn't have political parties. They hated factions. They talked about factions. They thought that all the leaders were going to do what was best for the country. And I think we're embroiled now in an awful lot of factionalism and parties and which is this and that. And we've got to back off a little bit, and that's what everybody means when they say bipartisan. Thank you.
Thank you.
3 right here. Okay.
Well, Tom, I was just going to follow up on the the idea of shortening the election period as part of reform in regards to the money issues and the other things. And what little research I've done, I don't see any specific ban that would say we could not shorten the period of time for elections. And I think that to create bipartisanship, if that were part of the bill, you'd probably have a lot of support for that.
I think you're right. I think that's something that, Ron, should definitely be explored. I don't have any doubt about it, is explore the shortening and other various parts of that would keep people working, in these jobs.
One of the key things that keep system together, of course, is the rules, and you talked about the checks and balances, but also there is the unspoken rules that there is no way we can codify all of them. Things like respect, civility, decency, and during this election, obviously, all of that went out the window. So, so my question is, what are the checks and balances in the U.S. government to protect these unspoken rules? Like, for instance, in society, if somebody starts acting out, there's like a number of things, a number of defense mechanisms that society uses to cast them out or get them back in line. What are the mechanisms in the government?
The biggest mechanism is at elections. You throw people out that you don't think are doing these kinds of things, not being civil, not being bipartisan, not working hard. You throw them out, and then you don't vote anybody in that is doing what you're talking about. So I mean, that's the biggest club you have right there. And then what I always encourage in my town hall meetings and my discussions with my constituents is telling people how much more of a voice they have today than they ever had in the past. I mean, you can buy a piece of stock and go to a stockholders board meeting and start advocating for a variety of things. For example, corporations, I think, public corporations should disclose their political expenditures. And already many public corporations are doing that. So you can advocate for some idea like that, not necessarily that one, but that calling into shows, I mean, Jill, when I watch C-SPAN and all those people are calling in, they get to talk longer than the person asking the question. She says, and it's a real, it's a real exchange. You're calling in, you can call in to talk radio, you can go on radio yourself. There are so many things that people can do to get their voices out there on this particular issue like you're talking about. But I think the biggest club is an election, and that's why, we'll see what happens this election. We're 5 days away, see what the judgment is of the public.
Jenna,
So I want to raise a dimension that hasn't been raised yet, but that was definitely on the mind of our founders. I'm delighted. I think there are a number of people in this room who are delighted to hear so many references to the founders. You've got a bunch of constitutional geeks here. So,
Good.
So federalism. So with congressional gridlock, it leaves a power vacuum that the states can fill.
Right.
And I think that the Republican Party's been quite effective at organizing at the state level and promoting their policies. So I'm wondering to what extent the National Democratic Party has been thinking about the states as partners in policy development.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's really is the beauty of federalism, is that when something is deadlocked at the federal level, the states move in. And so look at all the reform I talked about. Campaign finance reform. Here in New Mexico, most of our elections now are publicly financed elections. You know, we're taking the big money out, we're limiting to small contributions, all of those kinds of things. Another activity that's occurring across the country in the whole reform space is nonpartisan commissions to draw district lines, whether it's state legislative districts or federal congressional districts. And so California, I was talking to somebody here earlier, they were advocate of the jungle. It's called a jungle primary, but really what it is a primary that's kind of forced everybody to the middle, and people feel that that's been real reform in California. You've seen in Iowa, and the key here is a nonpartisan commission that's given specific instructions in the law to draw districts that have nothing to do with partisanship. And so you get away from the politicians picking their voters so that they can be in office for lifetime, and then the voters actually pick the politicians. And in better districts, in the better drawn districts, you're going to get a lot more bipartisanship. And I think if you look at delegation, when I look at Iowa's delegation to the Congress, I see much more bipartisan members of Congress. I'm not over in the House right now, but I still work out in the House gym, and I see a lot of the folks, and I like to stay in touch with the House because it's much more of a I don't know, collegial place in the Senate in a way. But anyway, so there's a lot of room. I could go on and on, but there's a lot of reform that's taking place at the state level. I hope both Democrats and Republicans are involved in that, and the national parties. But you're right, the Republican Party has invested in what I would call infrastructure since Barry Goldwater. I mean, they've gone out and really thought about what are the institutions and how do you cultivate people and how do you develop leaders and how do you take people that are doing your message and get them someplace so they can write a book and then go out and talk about it. They've covered all of that, and they've been putting hundreds of millions of dollars in it since 1964. And the Democrats, I think we're a little naive. We say, elect a great president and then forget about it. He's going to do he or she'll do a good job and be just fine. It's with the money out there, you can't ignore. You know, you have to get into it. That runs against my message of there shouldn't be so much money. But you know, that's what we're stuck in: the unilateral disarmament. Nobody wants to unilaterally disarm either. So, on the money side,
Bill, right there.
yeah. Thanks,
Senator,
Bill.
With the apparent gridlock on Capitol Hill, through the past two presidents, there have been an apparent explosion in the unchallenged use of executive orders. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah. Are there any particular ones you want to focus on? I mean, I think one of the things that's happened.
But from my background, a lot of the surveillance things that are going on are executive orders, not law of the land. So that's examples for you.
One of the areas, I mean, that's when I kidded David and talked a little bit about the Patriot Act when he was introducing me. You know, I think people take very seriously their privacy, they take the rights under the Constitution, the protections they have. And when I voted, you know, just shortly after 9/11 against the Patriot Act, I thought, you know, I've got some explaining to do. This could be the vote of my life and I'm going to get thrown out. And I came home And for almost a year, I went to every community and I talked to everybody through it, and it wasn't even an issue in the next election for me. So I think that if we tackle these issues, however we do it, we can do it in a way that you don't have to be worried that somehow you're going to get defeated. But what's happened is nobody wants to talk about them, and so we're back, I think, in many areas, especially this area you're talking about, to an imperial presidency. And we haven't thought, when you're talking about institutions, we always thought in terms of war, that the reason we put the war power in the House of Representatives and put it into the Congress was that the people were going to decide whether we go to war. Well, right now, we can't even, we're not passing any authorizations. The president's operating off very old authorizations. All of the, like you're talking about, executive orders and things are trying to fill in the holes, and the president's trying to be transparent. But unless there's real pressure and you're passing a piece of legislation, it's hard to get the administration to even deal with you and tell you what all these executive orders mean. So it's a tough area, and Congress, once again, we're back to Congress doing its job in terms of oversight and in terms of the responsibilities we've been given, doing our oversight, doing our homework.
We've got 2 more questions because Tom has been keeping up the energy. I mean, you could probably keep this up forever. But Jeffrey has a question right here.
Hi, thank you. First of all, thanks very much for coming. We're told, or at least we hear so often, that excessive regulation is stifling innovation, that it's stifling entrepreneurism. And yet fraud and lack of compliance with regulation at ridiculous levels of dishonesty is rampant. Could you please give one example of a situation where excessive regulation really hurt some really good, bona fide, entrepreneurial or innovative gesture or impulse?
Well, I'm not in the business sector. I'll bet if we opened the mic up and ask out here, we'd get people that would step forward. I mean, the one area that I've been educated on a little bit by my constituents here is we have a fledgling kind of biotechnology and all that in Albuquerque. And I've met with them several times, and they've given me examples, and I've tried to follow up with them. I can't tell you that I pinned them down or that I can give you a specific example, but as I said in my remarks, I think there's a balance here in some of these areas. I mean, clearly when you get into some of these medical areas, I mean, Jill and I have some friends that want to do immunotherapy in terms of cancer. And, if they have the wealth, they fly off to some country in South America or Europe or something and get it done over there. And what they say is, we'd like to do it here, but the FDA hasn't approved it. You got to get into a study. It takes you too long. And so they go off and do that. So I think maybe that would be the area that I would say is that people would argue that we are too slow through the FDA and the trials and everything else. But I would just come back to the same construct and say, we've got to have regulators that are really smart in the area they're regulating in, and that are tough, and that are willing and know about reaching the balance, and are willing to take a little bit of a risk. I mean, somebody repeated to me here, they said the rule at a particular agency was, not on my watch. We're not having anything go wrong. Well, if you do that kind of approach, nothing ever go wrong, then you're going to be saying no to everything. And you're kind of reminded of the lawyer that you always say no because you never get in trouble. And that's where we're at. But the regulatory part, I mean, I could go in with you in Tosca, for example, because I really know about regulating chemicals and things now. Very complicated area, and it's going to be very tough now. We have 85,000 chemicals in circulation. We grandfathered 56,000 of them, and then in 1976, and then with 750 to 1,500 coming on the market, I'm sure there are people that are going to argue there, now that we put this regimen in place, that they have chemicals that are innovations and they're being held up because there's going to be a big backlog. I mean, we got more money in this bill to do more testing, but how can an agency that has a $58 million budget a year, and it costs about $2.5 million to do testing on a chemical, how are they going to do the work on the 85,000 chemicals? And Europe has, been doing this for a long time. So anyway, I hope that helped you on that. But in your meetings, I mean, if it comes up on the panel, I'll bet you have business folks here. And I'm sure that they could answer, and you maybe want to get in that discussion. Like
Jeffrey he's a musician.
Yeah.
And he likes rule systems, generative rule systems.
Okay, no, I know he likes it.
So let's take one last question from the aisle over there. Yeah.
So I wanted to take this into a slightly different direction. So I work in the finance industry, where we're trying to understand the risks that we're taking, and in that effort, we spend some time to better model regulatory or policy risk in some of the investments we're going to be making. And one thing we struggle with a lot is that the economic incentives don't always seem to apply to the regulatory policy framework. And then, so the question for you is, can you talk a little bit about, as we're thinking about valuing and buying and selling public companies, how do we think about modeling policy and regulatory risk, bringing it around to the incentives that politicians and lawmakers are going to respond to?
That's a tough one, and I don't have a huge expertise in that area. But I think when some of this is you're talking about mergers, right? Which
not necessarily.
Not necessarily. Okay.
So thinking about the healthcare system, for instance,
right?
There is, as we try to think about which government is going to come in and how we should think about the regulatory risk for the pricing, et at what level do we? So the government is not necessarily interested in maximizing profit or how do they define welfare? What are how can we better find a common denominator for the things that lawmakers and legislators would try to maximize in an industry?
Yeah, well, in the area of healthcare, I mean, there's no doubt that you're going to have policymakers, presidents, members of Congress pushing for what you've seen in the last couple of years. They're always trying to look out for their constituents, and we hear stories all the time, about people that have fallen through the system or can't get this kind of care or whatever it is. And then many people, as you know, we still have a high uninsured. What we did with the Affordable Care Act was move dramatically forward. We now have 20 million people that are covered that weren't covered as a result of that, but we still have a lot more problems, and that's part of the gridlock here that we're talking about. We don't come back after we've passed this law. We should be, you kick yourself in the Congress, you can't find a Republican to work with on it because we've taken 70 votes to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And I know they really don't mean it. They really don't, because if they really repealed it, there'd be an absolute rebellion of these 20 million people, and people would be out in the streets and the whole thing. But it's become a partisan thing, and it's run through a couple of elections, and they're just doing it knee-jerk. I don't know if that helped you, but I just want to close, David, to just thank you for tackling this. I think this is something that's tremendously important to our society, and I think the founders tried to think through a lot of these problems and structure things so that we had government that worked, and we've hit this critical phase where it's not working, and it's great to have such smart, intelligent, capable people looking into this. And
British are coming back to reclaim the colony.
Yeah.
You've demonstrated your inability to self-govern. So thank you very much, Tom. Fantastic talk.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Tom. It was marvelous. And actually, you know, I have to say, the amount of energy and momentum and drive necessary to get your kind of work done leaves me speechless. Anyway, folks, thanks for coming tonight, and we will see you, many of you, tomorrow morning.